My name is Toma Vale, and for 31 years I carried water up the terraces of Silt Harbor without once thinking the deep would ever say my name. I'm an old man now, and my hands do not hold a yoke the way they did. But they remember. They remember the cold of the wellstone and the ache of the rope, and the particular weight of a full jar riding the hip. If you have never carried water for a living, you cannot know how a body learns a thing until the thing lives in the bones and not the head. My back knew the road before my eyes were fully open in the morning. That is the kind of man I was, a carrier. The lowest of the trades, below the net menders, below the salt boilers, below even the gull scarers who threw stones at the birds off the drying racks. A water carrier is a mule that talks. That was the joke, and I laughed at it too, because a man who cannot laugh at his own yoke will break under it. So understand that when I tell you the deep spoke to me and called me keeper, I am not a man who ever expected to be called anything but Toma, or carrier, or you there. I had no lineage anyone bragged of. My father hauled the same water before me and drowned in a storm tide before I was old enough to hate him for leaving. My mother gutted fish until her fingers went to bone-white claws, and then she died too, quiet, in a way that made the neighbors say she went easy, as if easy were a mercy and not just another word for alone. I inherited a yoke, a stone house the size of a boat, and a root. That was all. That was supposed to be all. Silt Harbor sat at the throat of a drowned valley on a world the star charts called Ocean, and the locals called nothing at all, because you do not name the ground under your own feet. Above the harbor rose the terraces, 9 of them, cut into the black rock by hands so old that no one living remembered the cutting. And at the heart of the terraces, older than the terraces, older than the black rock had any right to look, stood the rain well. I should describe the harbor to you, because a man cannot understand a trade without the place that made it. Silt Harbor was a poor town that pretended, on its good days, to be a fair one. The valley it sat in had drowned in some age before memory. The sea had come up the throat of it and stopped, and left a long finger of salt water reaching inland between black cliffs, and on the shelves of rock above the water the people had built. Net menders and salt boilers on the low shelves near the tide. The fish drying racks higher, where the wind could reach them. The market and the sick house and the elders' hall on the middle terraces. And the boats, always the boats, because Silt Harbor lived and died by what the men brought back from the deep water in the mornings, and what the women could dry and salt and sell before it rotted in the wet air. It was a place of hard weather and hard work and small mercies, and it did not much like a man who thought himself above his station, and it liked a man who thought himself below it even less. You did your trade. You did not complain past what complaining a body needed to stay sane, and you kept your strange thoughts to yourself, because a harbor that lives on the edge of drowning has no patience for a man who talks to stone. 9 terraces, I said. The carriers knew them the way a sailor knows the ropes, not by counting but by feel. The first was the market shelf, wide and flat, where the low wells were, the brackish ones, the ones that gave water you could wash in and boil your fish in, but not, if you had any choice, drink. The second through the 5th were dwellings, stone houses stacked close, mine among them, small and dark and smelling always of the sea. The 6th held the sick house and the birth rooms, where the sweet dawn water went. The 7th was empty, a broad terrace of bare black rock that no one built on, though no one could say why, only that it had always been left bare, as if the harbor knew, in some way it had forgotten it knew, that the ground between the town and the well should be kept clear. The 8th was the last of the climb, steep and narrow, a goat path more than a road. And the 9th, the top, held only the rain well, alone on its shelf of black rock against the sky, with nothing around it but wind and the long drop back down. I should tell you what the rain well was, because the word well will mislead you. It was not a hole in the ground with a bucket. It was a structure, a ring of pale gray stone as wide across as a thrashing floor, standing waist-high, and inside the ring the water went down in a shaft so deep that no dropped stone ever came back with a sound. Around the outer rim ran a band of carved marks, not letters, not pictures, but something between, grooves and hollows and raised nodes that caught the light and held it a breath too long. And rising from the center of the well, straight up out of the black water, stood a single spire of the same pale stone, thin as a mast, taller than 3 men, its top crowned with a cluster of what looked like folded petals or folded hands, closed tight, sealed, dark. The elders said the well had come with the world. The scholars who visited from the inland cities said it was a machine, a very old machine, left by makers no one had a name for, and that the folded crown was a mouth, or an eye, or a hand, and that it had been closed since before the first boat put out from Silt Harbor. 900 years, they said, though they said it the way men say numbers they cannot truly hold, 900, as if it were only a little more than 9. I had my own sense of the well's age, and it was not the scholar's sense, which was a number written in a book. Mine was a thing my hands knew. When you lay your palm on a stone every dawn for 31 years, you learn the true grain of it the way you learn a face. And the grain of the rain-well stone was wrong for anything human. It was too even. See, cut rock is rough, or if it is smooth in the streaked, layered way that water and time make. The well stone was smooth the way still water is smooth, all through, with no grain and no seam and no chisel mark anywhere, as if it had not been cut at all but poured or grown or simply willed into that shape and had never once in all its years worn. The terraces around it had weathered. The black rock had cracked and shed and grown its stubborn gray lichen. The well had not aged a day that any hand could feel. That was how I knew, better than the scholars with their number, that it was older and stranger than anything else on Ossian. Old things wear. The well did not wear. It only waited. Here is the thing about the rain well that made it more than a monument. It gave water. Not the shaft. The shaft was dry as far down as any lamp could reach, dry and dark and silent. But every dawn, in the hour before the sun cleared the eastern cliffs, the folded crown at the top of the spire wept. A slow sweat of clean water beaded on the closed petals and ran down the spire and pooled in a stone basin at its foot, and that water was sweet, sweeter than the brackish stuff that came up from the low wells, sweet enough that a sick child given a cup of it would keep it down when it kept nothing else. The whole harbor lived partly on that dawn water. It was rationed. It was holy. And it was the water carriers who fetched it, before light, up the 9 terraces, and carried it down to the sick houses and the birth rooms and the tables of men who could pay. There was never much of it. That was the cruelty and the mercy of the dawn weep both. It gave enough, and never more than enough. On a good morning the basin held perhaps 4 full jars before the weep slowed and stopped. 4 jars for a whole harbor. So the rationing was fierce, and the elders had made their laws about it long before I was born. The sick first, then the newborn and the birthing mothers, then the very old, and only what was left after all of those went to the market, where it fetched a price that made men rich who had never carried a jar in their lives. I hated that part of it, the selling, the way the last cup of a holy thing went to whoever had the coin. But I did not make the laws. I only carried what the elders' tallyman marked out, and I kept my own small law inside the larger one. I'll not take more than the sick need, which meant that on the mornings when the weep ran thin, when there was barely enough for the coughing and the birthing, I told the market steward there was none left for him. Even when there was a jar's worth, I might have poured him for a coin in my own pocket. He knew it, too. He would stand there with his coin and look at the basin and look at me, and he knew I was keeping back what he could have bought, and he called me a fool for it more than once to my face. A carrier who won't take a bribe is a fool who'll die poor, he said. And I said, likely so. And carried the sick their water, and died poorer than him, and would not trade the dying for his. That was my route. Every dawn of my working life, I climbed to the rain well in the dark and waited for the crown to weep and filled my jars from the basin and carried them down. 31 years. I want you to sit with that number the way the scholars could not sit with theirs. 31 years of dawns. Call it 11,000 mornings. 11,000 times I stood at the foot of that spire in the cold and the dark and watched a 900-year-old thing sweat clean water into a bowl. And 11,000 times I said the same words to it before I filled my jars. I never told anyone I spoke to the well. A man who talks to stone is a man the neighbors watch, but I did. Not prayers, I was never a praying man, just words. The kind of words you say to a beast that works beside you, or to the sea when you are alone on it. When I was young, the words were complaints. Cold morning, my back. The rope's worn again. When I was older, the words softened, the way a man softens toward anything that has stood beside him for 30 years without asking anything of him. And every morning, no matter the year, before I dipped the first jar, I laid my hand flat on the cold stone of the rim and I said, "Thank you for the water. I'll not take more than the sick need." That was all. It was not scripture. It was just a thing I said, a carrier's manners, the way you thank a mule with a rub between the ears even though the mule cannot know your meaning. I said it because my father had said it, and I had heard him say it once through the fog before he drowned, his hand flat on the rim just so, and it had lodged in me the way things lodge in a boy who loses a father young. I'll not take more than the sick need. Some mornings I had to fight myself to keep to it, when a rich man's steward stood at my elbow with coin, wanting extra for a feast, calling it medicine when it was luxury. But I kept to it, not out of virtue, out of stubbornness and out of a promise to a dead man I never got to know. I have thought a great deal in my old age about that promise, because it turned out to matter more than anything else I ever did, and I made it without knowing I was making it. I was 9 years old. My father took me up the terraces one morning to show me the route, because a carrier's son is a carrier, and there was no question in either of our minds that I would take up the yoke when I was grown. It was a foggy morning, the kind where the top terrace floats loose from the world and the well comes at you out of the gray like a thing surfacing. My father set down his jars. He laid his hand on the rim, and he said his words, "Thank you for the water. I'll not take more than the sick need." And then he turned to me, a boy shivering in the fog, and he said the only thing about the well he ever told me, the only piece of a father's wisdom I got before the storm tide took him. "It's not ours, Toma," he said. "The water. We don't own it and we don't sell it, whatever the market men do with their share. We carry it. That's all a carrier is, a pair of hands that carries a thing that isn't his to people who need it and doesn't keep any back for himself. You remember that. You take only what the sick need. The rest isn't yours to want." I did not understand it as anything but a rule then. A father's rule, the kind you follow because he said it, and because his hand was heavy. I did not know it was the whole shape of a thing older than the harbor. I only knew that 3 months later he was gone, drowned in a storm tide with 4 other men off the drying racks, and that the last clear picture I had of him was his hand flat on the well's rim in the fog, saying the words. So I said the words too, every dawn of my working life, and I kept back the rest even when I could have sold it, and I told myself it was for the sick, and it was, but underneath the sick it was for him, for the one clear picture, for the heavy hand, for the man I never got to know and could only obey. A boy will keep a dead father's rule his whole life just to keep the father. I did not know I was also keeping a sea. The scholars came and went over the years. They lowered instruments into the dry shaft and got nothing. They pressed the carved band with their fingers and their tools and got nothing. Once a delegation from the Inland Academy came with a machine of their own, a thing of brass and glass that hummed, and they set it against the well and tried for 3 days to make the folded crown open, to make the well speak. That was their word, speak. They believed the well was a kind of throat that had gone silent. And on the 3rd day the crown did not so much as tremble, and they packed their brass and went home and wrote, "I am told," that the rain well was a passive condensation structure of no further interest. Passive, of no further interest, to men who had asked it a wrong question for 3 days and heard no. I watched those 3 days more closely than the Academy men ever knew because I had nowhere else to be at dawn, and because a thing I had tended 30 years was being handled by strangers, and a man watches strangers handle his own. They were not cruel men. I will say that for them. They did not chip at the stone or foul the basin, but they were certain men, and certainty is its own kind of blindness. They stood at the well the way a magistrate stands over a prisoner, arms folded, waiting to be answered, sure of their right to an answer. On the first day, the lead scholar, a tall man with ink-stained fingers, pressed his palm to the carved band and said, loud and clear, as if the well were deaf rather than silent, "We come from the Academy of Ilm. Open. Show us your mechanism." And the well did nothing, because you do not command a thing to open by telling it your credentials. On the second day, they brought the brass machine and made it hum against the stone, a hum that set my teeth on edge. And the lead scholar consulted his glass dials and frowned and told his fellows the resonance was wrong. They must find the resonance, and they turned their dials this way and that all day, hunting a frequency, a key, a right note that would make the well give up its secret. As if it were a lock, as if a thing that had waited 900 years could be picked. And all 3 mornings, while they hunted their resonance and consulted their brass, I did the thing they never once thought to watch. I came before them in the true pre-dawn dark, before their machine woke and their arguments began, and I laid my hand on the rim in the cold, and I said my words, "Thank you for the water. I'll not take more than the sick need," and I waited for the weep, and I filled my jars, and I carried the sick their water, and I was gone back down the terraces before the academy men had finished their morning tea. They saw me, on the 3rd morning, coming up as they came up. The lead scholar looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of the furniture that has, unaccountably, moved. "You're the water fellow," he said. "You come every day." I said I did. "And it gives water on its own." I said it did, every dawn. He turned to his fellows and said something about condensation cycles and the diurnal temperature gradient, and turned back to his brass and did not ask me another thing. He had a machine to make the well speak. It did not occur to him to ask the man the well had let fill his jars for 30 years, because that man was a carrier, and carriers do not know things. That is what certainty does. It looks straight past the answer because the answer is standing in poor clothes, holding a yoke. I carried water past their machine all 3 of those mornings. I laid my hand on the rim as I always did. I said my words as I always said them. And on the 3rd morning, when the academy men were cursing over their silent instruments, the crown wept as it always wept, right on time, and I filled my jars from the basin at its foot while they stared at their brass and did not once look at me. A carrier is furniture. That is the truth of the low trades. You can stand in the center of a miracle and be furniture, if the miracle is quiet and you are poor. I tell you all of this so you will understand that what happened was not sudden. It looks sudden in the telling. It was not. It was 31 years of dawns, 11,000 mornings, 1 hand on the stone and 1 sentence. And then, on a morning I did not know was different, the ground of it all shifted under me, and I learned that the well had been listening the whole time, and that listening is not the same as silence, and that some things wait not for the right tool, but for the right hand said the right way long enough that waiting itself becomes a kind of trust. The morning it happened. I was 52 years old, and my knees had begun to tell me my carrying days were numbered. It was the tale of the wet season. The dawns were cold and the terraces slick, and I climbed slower than I once had, testing each step. There was no one else on the terraces. The other carriers came later, for the 2nd and 3rd fetching. The pre-dawn run to the well itself had been mine alone for years, by seniority, which in the low trades is the only reward you ever get, first at the cold, first at the dark, first at the climb. I did not resent it. Those solitary dawns at the rain well were the closest thing to peace my life ever held. I reached the top terrace in the gray dark. The well stood as it always stood, pale against the black rock, the spire rising into the last of the night, the crown folded and dark. The basin at its foot was empty, waiting for the dawn weep. I set down my jars. My breath smoked. Somewhere below, the harbor was still asleep. A single lamp burned at the sick house, where I knew a fisherman's daughter had been coughing blood for a week, and the dawn water was the only thing that eased her. I remember thinking of her. I remember thinking, I'll carry hers first. I laid my hand flat on the cold stone of the rim. I said my words, "Thank you for the water. I'll not take more than the sick need." and the stone under my hand grew warm. I want to be careful here because this is the moment everything turned, and I have had years to be careful about it. The stone did not flare hot. It did not shock me. It grew warm the way a stone grows warm when a hand has rested on it a while, except my hand had only just touched it, and the morning was cold, and the warmth came from under the stone, from within it, rising to meet my palm like something turning over in a long sleep and feeling, at last, a familiar weight. I did not pull my hand back. I have asked myself many times why not. Any sensible man pulls his hand back from stone that warms without cause. But I did not, and I think the reason is the plainest one. After 31 years, that rim was more familiar to me than the walls of my own house, and you do not flinch from a thing you have touched 11,000 times. So I kept my hand where it was, and the warmth spread out from under my palm along the carved band, and one by one, all around the great ring, the grooves and hollows began to fill with light. It was not a bright light. That is the first thing I would tell any scholar who asks, and some have. It was not a blaze. It was a deep, soft blue, the blue of very clean water seen at a great depth, the blue you see if you drop a pale stone into a still pool and watch it sink until the water swallows its color. That blue rose in the carvings and flowed around the ring, from under my hand, all the way around the vast circle, and met itself on the far side and closed. The whole rim of the rain well glowed with slow, deep-water light, and the light was not cold. It was the same warmth I felt under my palm, made visible. I looked up at the spire. The folded crown, dark my whole life, was catching the light from below, the deep blue climbing the pale stone, and as I watched, the petals, the folded hands, the sealed mouth, whatever the makers had meant them to be, began, without a sound, to open. 900 years and no sound. I had expected, in the half-second I had to expect anything, a grinding, a crack, the groan of old stone giving. There was none. The crown opened the way a flower opens in a time-lapse a scholar once showed me on a glass plate, smooth, unhurried, inevitable, as if it had been opening slowly all along and I was only now given the eyes to see it complete the motion. The folded petals spread, and within them was not stone. Within them was water, a sphere of water the size of a man's head, held in the air at the top of the spire by nothing I could see, turning slowly, and lit from within by that same deep blue, so that it hung there at the crown of the rain well like a small held sea, like an eye, like a drop of the whole ocean lifted up and made to shine. I stood at the foot of the spire with my hand on the warm stone, and I looked up at the held water, and the held water, I have no better way to say it, looked back. I did not run. I want that known, not out of pride, but because it matters to what came after. A younger man might have run. A man with more life ahead of him and more to lose might have run and told the harbor and brought the elders and the scholars and their brass, and the moment would have belonged to them. But I was 52 and tired, and alone in the cold with a thing I had tended for 31 years, and I had nowhere I needed to be except the sick house with the daughter's water. So I stayed. I stayed and I looked up at the impossible thing the well had become, and after a while, I do not know how long, I did the only thing I knew how to do in the presence of the rain well. I spoke to it. "You're awake," I said. My voice sounded small on the empty terrace. "After all this time." The held water turned, and the ring of light under my hand pulsed once, gently, like a slow heartbeat, and I understood, not with my ears, with something deeper, the way you understand the sea is angry before you hear the wave, that it had heard me. That it had always heard me. Every cold morning, every complaint about my back and the worn rope, every soft word of my later years. Every time I said thank you for the water, I'll not take more than the sick need, and meant it and kept to it. The well had heard and held and waited, and none of it had been the talking to a mule I had always half believed it to be. I had been speaking to something that listened for 31 years, and I had not known, and the not knowing had been the point. If I had known it listened, I would have performed for it. I would have wanted. Instead, I had only ever been myself in the cold, an ordinary man keeping an ordinary promise to a dead father, and that self, unperformed, unwatched as far as I knew, was the exact self the makers had built the well to wait for. The petals of the crown drew back further, and the sphere of held water descended. It came down the length of the spire slowly, unhurried, trailing that deep blue light, and it stopped at the height of my face, an arm's length away, hanging over the center of the well shaft, turning. Up close it was not a smooth ball. Its surface moved, currents in it, slow spirals, a whole small weather of water turning inside itself. And in its depths I saw shapes I could not name, pale and folded, like the crown had been, like things asleep. I have wondered since whether they were the makers themselves, or images of them, or only the shapes the deep sea beneath the world takes when it dreams. I did not ask. Some things a man is not meant to pull the lid off, even when they are turning an arm's length from his face, and he has waited his whole life without knowing he was waiting. I did not reach for it. A lifetime of "I'll not take more than the sick need" had taught my hands restraint. I only stood and looked and let it look at me. And I think I have come to think in my old age that the not reaching was itself the last small proof. The sphere hung there, offered, the most precious thing on the world made small and brought down to my face, and I did not reach for it, because it was not mine to want, and a lifetime had taught my hands the difference between what is offered to be taken and what is offered to be kept. I kept my hands at my sides, and the well, I think, saw that and was satisfied. And then the rain well spoke. I have been asked more times than I can count how it spoke, whether it made a sound, whether the voice was a man's or a woman's, old or young, loud or soft. The truth is harder than any of those. The voice did not come through the air. It came up through the stone under my hand, up my arm, into my chest, and it arrived in me already understood, the way a memory arrives, the way your own name arrives when someone calls it across a crowd. You do not hear it and then decode it. You simply know it has been said and that it was said to you. The first thing it said was not words. It was a feeling, vast and slow and unmistakable, recognition. The recognition of a thing that has waited a very long time and has, at last, been met. I felt it break over me like a tide, and it was so large and so old and so entirely without threat that my eyes stung. And I, a grown man who had not wept at his own mother's grave, stood at the foot of the rain well with tears running cold down my face and did not wipe them. Then came the words, 3 of them, though words is too small. They arrived whole in the deep water voice that was not a voice, and they were these: Keeper of the deep. I did not understand, not then. I stood there with the held water turning before my face and the tears cold on my jaw, and I said, stupidly, the only thing a carrier could say: "No, you've the wrong man. I only carry the water." And the rain well, I would swear this to any elder, any scholar, any man who ever called me furniture, the rain well answered me. And in the answering it was almost gentle, the way a very old thing is gentle with a very young one. You carried it well. I need to tell you what I learned in the hour that followed, because the well did not merely name me and fall silent. Once it had spoken, once the great recognition had passed between us, it seemed to unfold in me, pouring what it knew into the place where its voice had arrived, and I stood at the foot of the spire in the growing dawn and learned what the rain well was, and what the water carriers had been, and why a 900-year no had on this morning become a yes. The makers, the well, did not give me their name, and I think they had none I could have held had not built the rain well as a machine to make water. That was a side thing, a courtesy, a small overflow of a far larger purpose. The well was a keeper. Beneath Silt Harbor, beneath the drowned valley, beneath the black rock, ran a deep. An aquifer is too small a word, an ocean under the stone is closer, a vast sunless sea held in the roots of the world, older than the surface water, cleaner, the true reservoir of the whole region, and the rain well was the door to it and the mind that watched over it. The makers had built it to hold that deep sea in trust, not to give it away, not to sell it or drain it or dam it, to keep it. To weep only what the surface needed, in the dawn, in small measure, and to hold the rest against the long droughts and the poisoned years that the makers, in their long sight, knew would come. And they had built into it a test. Not a riddle, not a lock, not a lineage. The scholars with their brass had been wrong about all of it, had spent 3 days demanding the well open the way you demand a servant open a door. The well was not waiting for the right question or the right tool or the right blood. It was waiting for a keeper. Someone who would tend the deep the way the makers had, who would take only what the sick and the thirsty needed and leave the rest, dawn after dawn after dawn, not for a reward, not knowing anyone watched, not even knowing there was a deep to keep. The makers had built the rain well to sweat a little water each dawn and to watch patiently across the centuries to see who came to fetch it, and how, and what they said and what they took. Kings had come. The well showed me, poured it into me, the long parade of the centuries. Warlords who had tried to break the crown open to seize the deep sea beneath and water their armies and their ambitions. Merchants who had tried to buy the well's secret. Scholars who had tried to solve it. Priests who had tried to worship it into speaking. And carriers. The carriers, generation on generation, the lowest trade, the talking mules, who came before dawn in the cold and laid a hand on the rim and took only what the sick needed and said their small manners to the stone and carried the water down. The well had watched them all. And in 900 years, no one, not one king, not one scholar, not one priest, had ever passed the test the makers set, because the test could not be passed by anyone who came to the well wanting. It could only be passed by someone who came to it giving, and kept coming, and kept giving, long past the point where any reward could be expected, until the giving was simply who they were. I saw them. That is the only way I can say it. The well did not tell me of these people. It showed them to me, poured them through me like water through a cloth, and I stood at the foot of the spire in the growing dawn and lived, in the space of what felt like an hour and may have been a minute, 900 years of others who had come to this well and failed. I saw a warlord in black lacquer armor, generations back, who had taken the harbor with fire and stood on the top terrace with his boot on the rim and his sword laid across the carved band, and demanded the well open the way he demanded cities open. And when it did not, he set his engineers to break it, and they hammered at the pale stone for a season and did not so much as scratch it. And he burned the harbor in his rage and marched away thirsty, and the harbor was rebuilt by the survivors. And the carriers came back before it was even rebuilt, before the ash was cold, and climbed to the well and laid their hands on the rim and said their words and took only what the sick needed. The well had felt the warlord's boot and the warlord's hammer. It had felt, the same season, the carrier's cold hands returning. It opened for neither, but it remembered both, and it knew the difference, and the difference was everything. I saw a merchant prince in a later century, who did not try to break the well but to buy it, who came in silk with a train of servants, and offered the elders a fortune to sell him the dawn water entire, every drop, for his ships to carry inland and sell at 10 times the price to towns dying of a drought. And the elders, God help them, were tempted, because the harbor was poor and the fortune was real. But the carriers of that year, the well showed me their faces, weathered, ordinary faces like mine. The carriers refused to fill his jars. They came to the well and took the sick their water as always and left, and would not carry a drop to the merchant's ships. And the merchant raged and the elders threatened, and in the end the carriers simply kept climbing before dawn and kept taking only what the sick needed, and the merchant could not make the water flow without them, because the market men did not know how to read the weep or where the sick truly were. And after a season the merchant took his silk and his ships and left. And the drought inland broke on its own, and the harbor stayed poor and stayed alive. The well had watched that too, watched the carriers hold at cost to themselves, to a thing they could not name. I saw priests, 3 orders of them across the centuries, who built no fires and offered no coin but tried instead to worship the well into speaking, who covered the top terrace in incense and chant and prostration, who named the well a god and fasted before it and cut themselves and bled on the black rock and begged it, for years, some of them for whole lives, to acknowledge them, to name them its own. And the well was silent to all of them, not cruel, silent. Because worship is a kind of wanting too. It wants the God to answer, wants to be seen and chosen and made special by the answering. And the makers had built the well to know the difference between a hand that keeps and a knee that begs. The priests wanted to be named. The carriers never once thought to ask. That was the whole of it. That was the 900-year secret the brass machines could never find. The well opened only for the one who did not come to be opened for. And I saw the carriers. Not as a class, not as a trade, as people, one after another, their faces poured through me. A stout woman with red hands, 400 years gone, who carried water up the terraces with a baby bound to her back because she had no one to leave it with, and laid her free hand on the rim and said words not so different from mine, and took only what the sick needed, and never knew the well felt her hand and marked it and waited to see if she would keep on. She kept on for 30 years and died in her bed and never knew. A one-eyed man, 2 centuries back, who had lost the eye to a fishhook and carried water because it was the only trade a half-blind man could do, and who cursed the cold every morning the way I did and laid his hand on the rim and took only what the sick needed for 26 years, and never knew. A boy who took the root at 12 when the plague took his whole family and carried it alone, weeping some mornings, and laid his small hand on the rim and said the words his dead mother had said, and took only what the sick needed even in the plague year when the sick were everyone and the temptation to hoard was a fire in the blood, and grew old carrying it, and died, and never knew. Hundreds of them. The well showed me hundreds of them, and everyone had laid a hand on that rim and taken only what the sick needed and left the rest, dawn after dawn after dawn, and not one of them had ever been named, and not one of them had ever asked to be, and the not asking was the very thing that made them the keepers the well was waiting for. The carriers had been keeping the deep for 900 years and none of them had ever known it. My father, hand flat on the rim, drowned before it ever warmed to him. His father before him, all of them. Tending a trust they could not see, passing down a manner, I'll not take more than the sick need, as if it were only a carrier's superstition, when it was in truth the exact shape of the keeping the makers had waited 9 centuries to find sustained across a whole life. And on this morning in me it had been sustained across a whole life, 31 years, 11,000 dawns, one hand, one sentence, one restraint held past the point of any watching. The makers had not built the well to open for greatness. They had built it to open for a habit, the humble, unwitnessed, unrewarded habit of a small hand keeping a great trust because keeping it was simply right. That was the depth they had bet on, not the depth of the sea beneath the rock. The depth in an ordinary person, the reservoir that does not run dry, the part of us that keeps faith with a duty no one is watching us hold. That is the HFY of it, if you want the scholar's word for what my people are. Not that we are clever. The academy men were cleverer than I will ever be. Not that we are strong, warlords stronger than any carrier had tried the crown and failed. The makers in their long sight had reached past cleverness and strength and blood and worship, and had bet the keeping of a world's deep sea on the plainest thing in us, that somewhere in the low trades in the cold before dawn, there would always be some ordinary hand that took only what the sick needed and left the rest, and kept doing it, and never told a soul and never asked why. They bet on that, and they were right. For 900 years in the poorest trade on Ossian, they were right dawn after dawn, and no one ever knew. The held water hung before my face, turning, and the deep blue light lay soft on the terrace, and I understood at last why it had called me keeper. Not because I was chosen, because I had, without ever knowing it, already been doing the keeping all my life, and the nomming was not a gift the well gave me. It was a thing the well finally said out loud that had been true for 31 years. I don't know how to keep a sea, I said. My voice was steadier now. I only ever kept a promise to a dead man. And the rain well answered, in the deep water voice, and this time I felt something almost like warmth in it, something almost like the pride an old master takes in a slow apprentice who has, without being told, learned the whole craft by doing. That is how it is kept. The sun cleared the eastern cliffs then. Light came down over the top terrace, ordinary gold morning light, and it fell on the rain well glowing its deep blue, and the two lights met and did not fight, gold on the stone and blue in the carvings, and the held sphere of water at my face caught both and turned them slowly in its depths. And in the basin at the foot of the spire on time as it had every dawn of my life, the water began to gather. The dawn weep, even now, even awake. Even having found its keeper at last, the rain well did the small daily kindness it had done for 900 years, sweating clean water into a stone bowl for the sick of a poor harbor, because that, too, was the keeping, and the keeping did not stop for miracles. I filled my jars. I want you to know that. In the middle of the largest thing that ever happened to a man of my trade, with a woken god of the deep sea turning its held eye before my face, I bent, and I filled my jars from the basin, because a fisherman's daughter was coughing blood in the sick house below, and the dawn water was the only thing that eased her, and it was my root, and I'll not take more than the sick need. And the well watched me do it, and I felt its recognition deepen, if such a thing could deepen, because it saw that the numbing had changed nothing in me, that I was still only the carrier doing the carrying, and that was the final proof, I think, the last confirmation the makers had built it to seek. A false keeper named at last would have set down his jars and reached for the sea. I picked up my yoke. The held water rose then, back up the spire slow, and the crown did not close over it but held open, and the sphere settled into the opened petals and turned there, lit, awake, a small held sea crowning the rain well in the morning light. It has stayed open ever since. The crown has never folded again in the years since that dawn. It hangs open on the top terrace of Silt Harbor to this day, weeping its dawn water as it always did, and glowing its deep blue in the pre-light, and the carriers still climb to it, and lay their hands on the warm rim, and take only what the sick need. I carried the daughter's water down first. She lived by the way. She is a netmender now with children of her own, and she does not know that the morning her fever broke was the morning the rain well spoke, because I did not tell her, and I did not tell the elders, and I did not tell the scholars, though they came. Oh, they came when they saw the crown standing open. They came with all their brass and their questions, and they asked me, the carrier who had been at the well that dawn, what I had seen, and I told them the crown had opened on its own, which was true, and that I did not know why, which was a lie, the only lie I have told about it, and I told it because the well's answer was not a thing for brass. It was not of further interest to men who came wanting. It never had been. It never will be. The same tall scholar came back, the one with the ink-stained fingers, older now, grayer, but as certain as ever. He stood on the top terrace and looked up at the open crown and the held sea turning in it, glowing its deep blue in the morning light, and I watched his face, and I will tell you, for one moment something moved in it that was not certainty. For one moment he looked like a man who has been asking the wrong question his whole life, and has just felt the shape of the right one pass by in the dark, too fast to catch. And then he mastered it and reached for his instruments and set about measuring the light and the water and the resonance of the open crown, hunting the mechanism, the trigger, the key. He measured for a month. He never found it. There was nothing for his brass to find, because the thing that had opened the well was not a frequency or a force but 31 years of a poor man's mornings, and you cannot put a number on that. And a man who can only trust numbers will stand in front of the answer forever and never see it. He went home and wrote, I am told, that the rain well had entered an anomalous active phase of undetermined cause. Undetermined cause. I was standing right there. He had asked me. I had told him a lie because the truth was not for him, and I do not regret it, and I would tell it again. The well kept its secret from the certain. So did I. That is a keeper's work too. I kept carrying for 6 more years, until my knees gave out entirely, and a younger carrier took the pre-dawn run. Those 6 years were, I think, the best of my life, and I could not tell a soul why. Every dawn I climbed the 9 terraces in the cold, and the crown hung open above me with its held sea turning and glowing, and I laid my hand on the warm rim. It was always warm now, for me, from the first touch each morning, and I said my words, and the well heard them, and sometimes, not every morning but sometimes, it answered. Never long, never grand, just a word or two in the deep water voice that arrives already understood. Cold morning, I would say, the old complaint, and it would answer, warm hands soon, and mean the weep, the water gathering in the basin. And I would laugh alone on the top terrace like an old fool, the only man on Ossian who knew that the rain well had a dry humor in it, buried under 900 years of silence, waiting for someone who came not to command it, but simply to keep it company in the cold. We were two old keepers by then, the well and I, tending the same trust, and the tending was easy between us. The way work is easy between two who have done it side by side a long time and no longer need many words. On my last morning I climbed the 9 terraces slow, testing each step, and I reached the well in the grey dark, and the crown hung open and the held sea turned in it, and the carvings warmed under my hand as they had warmed every morning since that first. I laid my palm on the rim. I said my words, thank you for the water. I'll not take more than the sick need. And then I said one thing more, the only time I ever asked the well for anything. There'll be another after me, I said. There always has been. Watch for them the way you watched for me. They won't know they're keeping anything. That's how you'll know it's them. And the rain well answered, in the deep water voice that arrives already understood, and it said, I have watched for you across 900 years. I will watch 900 more. I took my hand from the stone. I filled no jars, that was the young man's route now. I only stood a while in the cold and the blue light and the coming dawn, an old water carrier at the foot of a woken god, and then I turned and went down the 9 terraces for the last time and did not look back, because a keeper does not need to look back at the thing he keeps. He knows it is there. He has always known. I am very old now. I will not climb the terraces again. But sometimes in the hour before dawn, I go to my door and look up toward the top terrace, where the deep blue glows soft against the black rock, and I think of all the carriers before me who kept the deep and never knew it, and all the carriers to come who will keep it and never know it either, and I am not sad. I am the opposite of sad, though I do not have the scholar's word for it. There is a sea under the world, held in trust, and the trust is kept. And it is kept not by kings or scholars or priests, but by the lowest hands in the poorest trade, dawn after dawn, taking only what the sick need and leaving the rest, because that is simply who they are and who we have always been. The makers saw that in us before we ever saw it in ourselves. They built a 900-year test and staked a world's deep sea on the depth of an ordinary person, and they won that bet, and they will keep winning it, dawn after dawn, in me and after me. For as long as there is a sick child at the bottom of the terraces and a cold hand at the top willing to carry the water down. The scholars wrote that the rain well was a passive structure of no further interest. Let them. Let the record say it. I know what it said to me in the deep water voice that arrives already understood. On the morning the stone grew warm under my hand after 31 years of cold. It said I was the keeper of the deep. And when I told it I only carried the water, it said the truest thing anyone ever said to me. The thing I would have every carrier who comes after me carry down the terraces in their bones the way I carried mine. You carried it well. That is how it is kept.